Well, I want to thank the West Michigan Academic Consortium, Sylvia Kaufman, and Professor Duff for the lovely introduction and for the invitation to give these two lectures. It's an honor for me to be here, given the long line of august scholars and thinkers who have given these lectures in previous years. Sylvia and I have been toying with the topic of this lecture for well over a year, and I hope and in fact pray that you find it engaging. In any case, thank you for coming today. We're going to be doing some hard thinking together. One point of introduction. The relationship between religion, ethics, and politics is contentious. In fact, those are topics you're not to speak about in private, public places, and we're going to do that. I often remind my students that among three of the great founders of Western ethics, there are others, but of three, Socrates was poisoned by the state for corrupting the youth and making them gods. Moses, after giving the law to Israel, was not allowed to enter into the promised land. And the third was crucified by the Roman Empire. So doing ethics in relation to religion and politics is very risky business. I want us to engage in some of that risk today. I want to start with some reflections on the overall theme and then turn to the specific lecture today, Religion, Violence, and Practical Atheism. This first lecture tries to understand the complexity of our main question, that is, does religion have a future? The second lecture this evening is interrelated with this and tries to provide an ethical response to the problems we will uncover today. I hope I can remain within the 5-hour time limit that Sylvia has assigned. Does religion have a future? There are 4 ways that we can approach this question. Let me note these so that I can situate my own argument. First of all, we could ask this in a purely academic way. That is, we could say, we can't really answer the question until we define what religion is. And that topic would draw us into century-old debates and very current ones about what in the world do we mean by the term religion. We could do the same thing with ethics, since the concepts arose within the Greek and Roman world and is not indigenous to any of the world's religions. Rather than entering that debate, let me just stipulate some definitions of religion and ethics that will be important for my argument. Religion is about what is ultimately important, ultimately real, and ultimately empowering, to which people seek access for the orientation of their lives. That access to what is real, important, and a superhuman power is through certain practices, through prayer, cultic action, sacred texts, ecstatic experiences, saints, sages, saviors, and within some community. Further, religion understood in this broad way is always embodied in what we conventionally call the religions, such as Judaism or Buddhism or Christianity. Ethics, or moral philosophy, is reflection on the meaning and truth of the moral beliefs, values, and norms and rules that people use to orient their lives. We could say ethics is a kind of meta-reflection on morality for the sake of providing guidance for life. This means that sometimes ethics will show that a morality, even the morality of a particular religion, is in fact unethical and therefore not valid. Socrates found out what that meant to say in his community. Ethics is a discipline of normative reflection on the moral life. It is a kind of meta-reflection. So I've just stipulated definitions with respect to our first way of approaching the topic. The second way we could approach this topic is sociological. We could ask, in terms of societies, whether religion will have a future. And if we did, we'd get some interesting answers. Some would argue that religion has no future. This was what is called the secularization theory, made popular by Max Weber and others, contemporary new atheists, for instance, that the modern world means the eventual triumph of secularism. Others would argue that religion, sociologically speaking, does in fact have a future. What we're living in is a time in which we are seeing the emergence of post-secular cultures. There's many ways of being religious, as there are many ways of being secular. This is found among people like Charles Taylor, Hans Joas, Jose Casanova, and I'm going to be offering somewhat of this kind of argument. Or we could look at popular culture and imagination. Think of the Left Behind series, or Noah. There seems to be, at least for the sake of the popular imagination, a future for religion, if for no other reason than to make money. We could ask this sociologically in terms of the religions themselves, and then we get some rather interesting answers. They say both, yes, there will be a future, and no, there won't. Buddhism, for instance, one will finally reach nirvana, which would mean escaping the realm of rebirth and samsara, and therefore there'd be no more religion. Christians traditionally have believed in the coming of the kingdom of God and eternal life in God. Insofar as that happens, there will be no future to religion. Judaism waits for the Messiah. So interestingly enough, the religions think there will be, at least in human history, a future to religion, but ultimately there won't. We don't need religion when we're in heaven, right? One hopes. So we can also put the topic of this lecture not in terms of how to define religion, but also debates about religion and society. It's a secular society. Third, we might approach our topic with respect to beliefs about the nature of being human. It would seem that as long as humans are humans, that is, as long as we are creatures whose lives are fleeting, and so seek something ultimately important, as long as we are creatures who are easily duped and falsely console ourselves, we seek something that is real. As long as we are creatures who are fragile and vulnerable, and thus seek empowerment, both personally and socially, then religion is going to remain because it's a feature of human existence itself. Religion would only come to an end if we could overcome our fleetingness, our need for meaning and reality, the defeat of our fragility, the end of our social lives. But in that case, we would also have a future without human beings. So if we're not just asking about whether religion has a future in terms of the meaning of the ideas of religion and ethics, or in terms of current debates about the social realities in our global age, or just with respect to enduring features of being human, how then are we asking the question, does religion have a future? Well, we are today asking it from an ethical perspective, both from within the religions themselves and from the perspective of secularized society, marked by what I'm calling in the title of the lecture, practical atheism. You have to see what that means. This way of posing the question will encompass the three other ways of thinking about religion and its future without being reducible to any of them. So we might rephrase the question ethically. Is it good that religion has a future? Is it right and just that religion has no future at all? How might religion have a responsible future? In other words, we are asking how religious people and religious communities ought freely and responsibly to live out their practices and convictions. And we do so realizing that the question is also about us. We too are moral agents. And some of us might be religious in some way. I imagine many of us are in this room. I certainly am. So from the perspective of ethics, I can now state the overarching claims for the two lectures today, this morning and this evening. First, I'm going to argue that responsibility for what I call the integrity of life, I have more to say about that this evening. Responsibility for the integrity of life should ground religious identity rather than religious identity being the grounds of responsibility. I'm going to clarify that in a few moments. And second, When we see this connection between responsibility and religious identity, we will have also isolated a distinctive form of freedom in relation to religious convictions. Not the freedom of religion, to practice whatever religion one wants, nor freedom from religion. Secularized society allows people to be free from religion too. The kind of freedom I'm interested in is freedom within religious conviction. So this first lecture is to trying to get at the problem of religious violence and practical atheism in terms of identity and responsibility. The second lecture will make the case for responsibility and religious identity as a question about a distinctive form of human freedom that I think we need to practice more than we do. In the course of the two lectures, I am after the ethical grounds for choices about our religious identity, and I'm going to claim that the ground is a form of freedom, a freedom we must exercise if humanity is going to have a future. Now, there are actually solid reasons for making this argument about responsibility and freedom from within the religious traditions. I'm not saying anything that's necessarily external. I can take one example of this from Judaism and one from Christianity. Rabbi Hillel, circa 100 BCE, was once asked to explain the entire Torah while standing on one leg. And he replied, "That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow." That is the whole of Torah. Remarkable claim. The rest is just commentary. Go and learn. Unquote. That is the whole of Torah. Torah is a commentary on our responsibility for others, not on our identities. Or take, in the Christian example, 1 John 4:20. I always like it when a theologian gets to quote scripture. It's so rare. So 1 John 4:20. Remarkable statement. If a man says, "I love God," and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he that loves not his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? Unquote. Here too, just as with Rabbi Hillel, responsibility for and with others is a necessary condition for any right relationship with God. So while I'm going to be making some radical claims in these lectures, I hope I don't end up having to have the hemlock to drink, they are not unfounded. One claim is about how religious identities that are irresponsible, that is, they claim to love God but to hate others, and to do others what one would not have done to oneself, I'm arguing are ethically invalid. They are false forms of religion. The other claim is about a kind of freedom we must claim within the religious life for the sake of future life on this little planet. Again, I can only hope that I don't have to join Socrates in drinking the hemlock for corrupting the youth and making new gods. Now, with some understanding of the theme and direction of these two lectures, let me turn now to the specific topic of this first lecture, religion, violence, and practical atheism. If you all don't mind, I'm going to take my coat off some other time. See, when you have the University of Chicago professor in the room, there's a lot of hot air. So, religion's identity and violence. Religion and violence are too often bound one to the other. Hardly a day passes without the mention of violence committed in the name of religion. Just a few quick examples from like the morning newspaper. ISIS beheading foreigners as infidels. The killing of Israelis and Palestinians. Bombings of abortion clinics by Christian fanatics. Hindu fundamentalists attacking Islamic mosques. Buddhists, monks attacking Muslims in Burma. Mass suicides by cults, think of Jonestown. The sexual abuse scandal within the Roman Catholic Church. And so it goes on, day after day, year after year. Within the English-speaking world, this fact has given rise to two different, and I'm going to hopefully show very unhelpful responses. One response is by the so-called new atheists, like Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins. For them, religion itself is the problem. Religion is inherently violent, and it fosters ignorance and a magical mentality, which in fact is unlivable within our scientific age. Basically, religion has the facts about reality wrong and holds beliefs that foster fanaticism. The second, almost opposite view is a more liberal one. These are folks who argue fanatic religion is not true religion. Islamicists hijack Islam because it's really a religion of peace. Christians who protest at the burial of soldiers because of America's sins are not really Christians because Christianity is a religion of love. You get the point. Since we are interested, so the idea here is that any immoral or unethical form of religion isn't really religion. Now, since we're interested in ethics, and therefore actual human life and conduct and real human communities, we have to say that religion as lived by real human beings in real human communities is fundamentally ambiguous. It is a force for good, despite what the new atheists say, and it is also a force of moral evil, despite what well-wishing liberals might hold. Now we need to dig a little bit deeper into the roots. So I don't think it's the case that religions are hijacked. I'm trying to isolate a fundamental ambiguity or vulnerability within the religions where they can turn to violence, even as they have statements such as Hillel's in 1 John as a way to combat that vulnerability. Unless we're honest enough to say that the religions are fundamentally ambiguous, we will not understand anything that's going on in our current world. So we need to dig deeper into this religious sanction of violence. It is important to see that religious communities are intensely interested in the connection between a person's character, who they are, and their conduct, what they do. Conduct flows out of one's character, even as that conduct reflectively starts shaping one's character. Good roots produce good fruits, as that said, but the fruits also can produce new roots. Put in the terms I'm using, there's an intimate and complex connection between identity, who one is, and responsibility, the good conduct of life. A hateful character often engages in hateful actions and therefore reinforces their own hate. The same can be said for a caring person or a just person. Ideas about virtue and vices, as well as motives for action, are about this complex connection between identity and responsibility. Now, that connection is not absolute because human beings are fickle and ambiguous. Think here of, has anyone seen the TV series Breaking Bad? Is that a yes? Yes. Fabulous examination of how a character who starts out as a great teacher, loving father and husband, becomes slowly, through the interaction between who he is and what he's doing, a ruthless drug dealer. Likewise, circumstances can create tragic conditions where a good person must do wrongful things, or an unjust person forced to act justly. But that is merely to say that we are moral beings. That is, creatures who have to struggle to live by our higher angels, by what respects and enhances the integrity of life. Now, what is important here is that we are exploring the relation that can and ought to obtain between religious identity and moral responsibility. And the question is whether we can ever give priority to our responsibilities over our religious identities. That is, if religion is what, go back to my definition, is what is ultimately important, ultimately real, ultimately empowering, then it would seem that someone's religious identity, one's character formed by membership in a religious community, should trump all other identities one has. One's gender, nationality, even one's humanity. It would seem, on the very definition of religion, that I must be first and foremost a Christian rather than a father, a professor, a fan of the Chicago Fire soccer club, white, middle-aged, droning on in a warm room. After all, isn't a Christian to love God with all one's heart, soul, and mind? Reza Aslan, a professor at University of California, Riverside, and author of a book called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, which has gotten a lot of air recently, gets at this point in an op-ed on October 8th in the New York Times entitled, "Bill Maher Isn't the Only One Who Misunderstands Religion." Let me quote him because I'm going to agree and disagree with him. He writes, "What both the believers and the critics often miss is that religion is far more a matter of identity than it is a matter of beliefs and practices. As a form of identity, religion is inextricable from all the other factors that make up a human being's life. If that is so, then religious conflict would seem to be endemic to religious conviction. Why? Because my religious identity must be quite contrary to your religious identity. And one might call those who are outside of a particular religion the heathen, the pagan, the infidel, the outsider. In other words, what Aslan fails to ask is whether or not we have some degree of freedom of choice in how our identities are put together, all of which are complex. Now, I'm going to be arguing this morning and this evening that yes, indeed, we do have some kind of freedom. Make decisions a priority of choice about our identities so that they need not be pitted against folks with other religious identities. That's why I'm wanting to think about the connection between identity and responsibility. In making this argument, I agree with the philosopher and an economist, Amartya Sen. He wrote the following. This is an interesting quote. He writes, quote, "The point at issue is not whether any identity, whatever, can be chosen." That would be an absurd claim. I can't choose to be Chinese, for instance. It's not within the confines of my particular existence. But he goes on, "But whether we do indeed have choices over alternative identities or combinations of identity, and perhaps more importantly, substantial freedom regarding what priority to give to the various identities we may simultaneously have." Now, Sen doesn't go on to excavate that notion of freedom. I'm going to do that. But the point is, the question before us is, do we have the capacity in different circumstances to make choices about our identities and still remain religious? Still remain religious. Is it possible to make responsible choices for our identities and remain religious people if religion is about what is ultimately important, ultimately real, and ultimately empowering? We also need, if we're going to start answering that, we need to be a little bit more precise about the forms of religion and the kinds of violence they can incite. While Aslan and others approach the question of identity sociologically, we have to look at the religions themselves and how they understand the formation of identity. In other words, another step of ethical reflection is needed. We need to seek to uncover the roots of violence within the religions themselves. That is, we need to isolate the point of vulnerability to distortion and manipulation that is the entrance for violent expressions of a religion. And that point of vulnerability at the intersection of identity and responsibility is different within different kinds of religion. Let me try to explain this now. So let's turn to violence and the types of religion. Now, drawing on a distinction among scholars of religion, we can designate, on the one hand, missionary religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and non-missionary religions, Judaism, Hinduism, some indigenous North American religions, Confucianism, if, this is a big debated issue, if it's in fact a religion. These are different ways of conceiving how to be religious, which has profound implications for religious identity and the problem of religious violence. So briefly, and this is an oversketched, oversimple distinction, but it's going to help us get at what we're trying to get at, I hope. So briefly, non-missionary religions are ways of life in which one's membership in some ethnic group, say Jews, or caste, say a Brahmin or a member of the warrior class in Hinduism, or in relation to some sacred space and tribe, like some indigenous religion, your membership in that is what defines your identity, particularly your religious identity. It's interesting, in some indigenous religions, their term for themselves is the term for human being. So to be part of the group is to be part of a human being. It's to have a particular identity. One might not be a practicing Jew, and yet one's ethnic identity suffices for being a Jew in some respect. Similarly, one's caste in Hinduism demarcates the duties and obligations that ought to guide conduct and thus define one's identity. In Hinduism, as well as some indigenous religions, a temple must be built on a specific place in India. Just as Native Americans often have sacred places, say the Black Hills in North Dakota, or fishing sites in northern Wisconsin. Non-missionary religions, therefore, define religious identity in ways that demarcate a group and a place off from others. Religious rituals, moral guidance, religious leadership is set within the context of identity defined in that way. And they are meant to, the moral guidance, the rituals, the leadership are meant to strengthen that identity and to protect its purity, the purity of the community. As daily newspapers show, however, conflict over the ownership of land can stem from this tight connection between religious identity, group, and place, or sacred land. Again, for example, many Hindu temples must be built on a sacred place. And as has happened in the last several decades among fundamentalist and nationalist Hindus, if some other structure is built on that place, say a mosque, an Islamic house of prayer, then violence might, and in fact has, broken out about the rightful place of the Hindu temple where the mosque is. In other words, non-missionary religions define religious identity in such a way that without some religious or moral counterbalance, they are open to violent action towards others and the repression of some within the community itself. In this light, remember Hillel's teaching, because it's helping to break the mechanism within a non-missionary tradition. How about missionary religions, like Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism? They are likewise ways of life that are, sadly enough, open to distortion and violent, yet in very different ways than non-missionary religions. As the name missionary religion implies, to be sure, they have sacred places, say for Muslims the Kaaba in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, or Buddhists who give reverence to the Bo tree under which the Buddha supposedly achieved enlightenment, or Christians of all sorts giving homage to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, supposedly built on the site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial site. Yet while these missionary religions have sacred places, languages, and spread initially among a certain population, say Indians or Chinese with Buddhism, religious identity, what makes one, for instance, a Christian, is not defined, most basically, by place, language, or ethnicity. For missionary religions, religious identity is constituted by practices and beliefs that establish access to a superhuman power. A Buddhist, for instance, takes refuge in the Dharma, the teaching of the Buddha, and follows the middle way. A Muslim must abide by the pillars of Islam, and most importantly, confess that God is one and Muhammad is his prophet. One becomes a Christian through a ritual of baptism, that is a symbolic death and new birth, and the confession of faith in Jesus as the Christ. Of course, there are many different forms of Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, each with their own ways of fashioning identity. The point here is that missionary religions require a shift in one's identity with respect to the central convictions and practices of the religious community. Now, rather than explore the details, the divisions, and the differences within and between missionary religions, we can spot the point of vulnerability and therefore an opening to another form of religious violence. That is to say, under specific social, political, and economic conditions, the missionary religions can, but need not, become colonial religions. These colonial projects take different forms within the missionary religions and at different times. There were crusades during the High and Late Middle Ages. In 1095, the first crusade was begun by Pope Urban II. Its purpose was to restore Christian access to holy places in Jerusalem by vanquishing Muslim rule. In the late modern Western world, Protestant missionaries sought converts in Korea, China, Latin America, and Africa, often with the help of colonial military and economic powers like England, and on some accounts, the USA. There have been no less than 5 Islamic empires and 4 caliphates. Think today of the presumptions of ISIS to found a new caliphate. Of course, at different times and for different reasons, the peoples brought into these empires were treated in different ways, not all of which were violent. Yet for missionary religions, the specter of religious violence is the conviction that other people's lives must be colonized and remade within the terms of that religion's traditions. In the missionary religions, violence is often found when the demand for conversion of others overturns responsibility for them. Here, recall the words from 1 John, as within one missionary religion, a way to counter that vulnerability to try to colonize other human beings. Now notice, despite the differences among missionary and non-missionary religions, violence becomes possible when identity, however it's constituted, limits one's moral responsibility to respect and enhance the integrity of other people's lives, the outsider or the insider to one's community. In order to counter this all too real possibility, which we see enacted every day in the newspaper, we must make responsibility the priority in our choices about how we live out our religions. At least that's what I'm arguing. And I've already noted how that might work within Judaism and Christianity by appeal to Hillel and 1 John. There are other resources in other religious traditions. But paradoxically, if we are to remain religious, that is, if we're not just to translate all of our religious convictions into ethical categories, which is what the new atheists would want. If we are to remain religious, if a community is to be true to its convictions about what is ultimately real, important, and empowering, then we need a religious way of thinking about the priority of responsibility in choices about identity. That is to say, we cannot simply abandon religion in the name of ethics. That was the tactic of many modern Western thinkers from the 18th century Enlightenment on to the new atheists. Nor can we say that violent forms of religion, say violence done by Christians, is not real religion, but a religion hijacked. So how are we to avoid those two false ways, at least that is of addressing this? And this brings us to the last step in this lecture, and the idea of practical atheism. I think it's a good description, from the perspective of ethics, of what secularism really means morally. Now let me try to explain that. Everyone following so far? Going too fast? I'm rather passionate about what I do, so I can start speaking really fast and you may not be able to understand me. And if that's the case, just raise your hand and tell me to slow down. Okay? So what we've done so far is try to excavate within the religions the vulnerability to violence when one's religious identity is made more important than one's responsibility with and for others. Well, sorry. What we've done so far, I want you to see this train of the logic. After getting clear that we're doing ethical stuff and what we mean by religion and ethics, we've tried to isolate within the religions the vulnerability to making identity more important than responsibility for others. And that I'm suggesting is the roots for the possibility of certain forms of violence against others. We noted that there are differences in making a very simple distinction between missionary and non-missionary religions. We saw that that vulnerability is at different places because of the kind of religion they are. Now I want to turn to, since I said we're adopting a kind of post-secularist view of the world, I want to show how secularism has also got problems. And how secularism, or practical atheism, and violent religion feed on each other. That's where we're heading. And if that's the case, if I can make that argument, then I will have set up what I try to do later this evening, okay? So let's take our last step in this lecture and turn to the idea of practical atheism. I know that's an odd term, but I think it's very an important term if you see the issue from a religious perspective. What do I mean? Now, one of the most interesting things about the ancient religions is that they are primarily practical in orientation. The Buddha, Hebrew prophets, Muhammad, early Christian thinkers were not mainly interested in speculative proofs or theoretical arguments about the existence of God or the gods. What does that have to do with how we conduct our lives? For example, we could side with Einstein that, as he once famously said, God does not play dice with the universe. Or we could side with Bohr about quantum physics. But in both cases, theoretically and speculative views of reality, in both cases, it's not obvious what impact that would have on how we should live our lives worthy of our humanity. Quantum indeterminacy, a unified field theory, neither tells us very much about why we should not lie to each other. But religions are about the practical stuff of existence. They entail subsequent theoretical and speculative ideas, but fundamentally, we're which is why I define religion as I have, fundamentally, they're about the orientation and living out of life. This is why, for me, ethics is the best way to do theology, because the religions are profoundly concerned with how we conduct our lives. This means that the religions are less interested in theoretical atheism, denying that you believe in God. They are more worried about practical atheism. That is, living life as if there is no moral meaning to existence. That the gods or God do not give a damn about justice or love or equity or happiness or security. And this shows us the oddity of our situation. There are many, such as the new atheists, who deny theoretically the existence of God, even while they assume that one must tell the truth in one's scientific exploration. At the same time, there are many in religious communities who mouth belief in God or some God, and yet in their daily lives deny the reality of God, forsake the poor, strive for profit over truth, demean anyone who is not like oneself. But the religious, as I've tried to put it, are ways of life. They are practical in orientation and existence. The ancient and modern critics understood this better than many religious people. The Roman satirist Lucian once noted that if horses had gods, they would look like horses. In other words, human beings too readily project themselves as if the deity is going to be just like us. Now, it seems to me that our current situation is one in which there is not only religious violence within the types of religions we've explored, but also widespread practical atheism, both within and without the religions. That is, we live within post-secular societies where there are many forms of being religious and many forms of being secular. And in fact, oddly enough, the religious fanatic, the Hindu or Christian or Buddhist fundamentalist, often enough object to the infidel, the outsider, as parts of their community precisely for moral reasons. The West is often seen as morally corrupt and godless, as practical atheistic. The perception of the fanatic is that one needs to reassert socially and culturally religious values that have to do with the practical guidance of life. It is practical atheism that provokes outrage in the name of justice. Little wonder then that the lure of such group is precisely their seemingly high moral standards, or traditional standards. So just as with types of religion, that is non-missionary and missionary, we can seek the roots of secular practical atheism. There seems to be historically three reasons for current forms of practical atheism. That is, current forms of the denial of the relation between the divine or the sacred and what is good and just. What are those reasons that have given rise, understandably given rise, to forms of practical atheism? Well, the first was the bloody reality of the 20th century, especially the Shoah and other genocides. In the face of horrific and mindless evil, God seemed absent, unconcerned, impotent to interact. Indeed, it seems obscene to speak of God as the human good in the shadow of death camps or suicide bombers. Mass graves seem to require practical atheism. The second reason for current forms of practical atheism is that often claims about the human good seem, and this is particularly the case over the last couple decades and younger folk, that claims about the human good seem to trump the good of other forms of life. The idea that God guarantees and is the source and end of the human good has rightly come under searing criticism as being wantonly anthropocentric. That somehow we are the ones that matter and the natural world and other animals don't matter. This smacks of impiety by putting the human good as the divine purpose. If that is the case, then not only the worth of finite existence is limited to human beings, but it also moves the question of the meaning of the highest good from a theological and an environmental context to one that is narrowly anthropological. Not only is this a dangerous limitation of moral responsibility in an age of ecological endangerment, it is also hard to sustain in the face of scientific fact. No matter how grand and complex our lives are to us, we do not seem to be the purpose of the universe. But many traditional ways of understanding the religions would see us as the purpose of the universe. And that's provoked a lot of practical atheism. Because if religious discourse goes in that direction, then one must reject it precisely in order to live a moral life, to be environmentally responsible. Now, the third and final reason for current forms of practical atheism is the odd entanglement between the rejection of God and violent forms of theistic belief and practice. Ironically, practical atheism, with its source supposedly in the godless West or the Enlightenment or whatever, practical atheism provokes hyper-moralistic forms of religion found among suicide bombers, the censorship and pulping of scholars' books, the bombing of medical clinics, all in the name of the sanctity of life. Violent and murderous religious forms are drastic rejections of the kind of practical atheism we see in secular cultures around the world. Yet, as I've already noted, they also provoke dialectically the rejection of God, because as if the two just feed on each other. It seems morally obscene to believe in a God who commands violence, and therefore one must be a practical atheist. So I'm suggesting that hyper-moralistic or violent religiosity is the sibling, the twin almost, of the kinds of practical atheism that are now playing themselves out on the global scene. Both of these forms are strategies to reduce complexity into a more single-focused monistic perspective. So now, if the problems of the practical irrelevance of God for the practical atheism and the violence of religious convictions on the other side, if those two things define something about the moral and religious atmosphere of our global age, then anyone interested in ethics and religion must retrieve religious ideas and show their meaning to the actual orientation of life in ways that respect and enhance the integrity of life, one's own and that of others. And that requires combating this strange intersection that I've just noted between practical atheism generated by the horrors of the last century, as well as wanton anthropocentrism that endangers planetary life. We have to move beyond that and that which fuels fanatical religion, violent religion. Now, how to do so? We've got a real problem on our hands, folks. I hope you see the depths of the problem. Well, I gave one hint of an answer to this question earlier by citing Hillel and 1 John, as well as posing the matter in terms of choices about religious identity and its relation to responsibility. The kind of religion we seek, or I seek, I shouldn't speak for you, I suppose, is one in which the identity of individuals and communities is fashioned freely around the claims of responsibility for future life. This will not mean that we have to convert us all to the same religion, or that we must dilute religious life to its lowest common denominator. The issue is not how to become any less a Jew, or less a Hindu, or less a Muslim, or less a Christian, or less a Buddhist. It is rather how to interpret and to live out our convictions in ways that contribute to a living future. Now, let me conclude and then we'll have time for discussion. Okay? In this first lecture, I've tried to map some of the terrain that we have to cover in order to think ethically about religion in the future. We've seen different responses to the question, if religion has a future. I also explored different types of religion and the vulnerabilities each has to openings to violent expressions. We isolated the crux of the problem in terms of the relation between religious identity and moral responsibility. And finally, I noted the strange entanglement between forms of practical atheism that are absolutely understandable and the fueling of violent religion. In other words, I've tried to articulate our question about religion in the future in a way that enables us to see its religious and ethical dimensions. And so we can now ask, which religion and what future? Which of course is the topic of the next lecture. Thank you very much. Comments on and on. Yes?
Very, very interesting lecture, Doctor, and thank you so much. It has occurred to me that there is a connection you missed.
Mm-hmm.
I have been known to say, oversimplified, that the atheist scientist may say the laws of physics are the same everywhere, which means practically the same thing is there is no God but God. It seems to me there's a useful connection there we should be taking advantage of.
And what's the connection? Help me understand this, since I missed it.
The atheist scientist might say the laws of physics are the same everywhere. But it really means the same thing as a religious person saying there is no God but God.
Well, it's the same in form, but immensely different in content.
The difference,
It's the same in form, but immensely different in content.
I would like to submit, and then I'll sit down, that the difference is one of them insists on having something which is the essence of infinity, and the other one only requires something which is practical infinity.
Yes. Well, that's in a sense where I was going to go. He's asking, on the one hand, he wants to say that there's an equivalence between there is no God but God, there's one God, and certain physical laws of the universe. Okay? And then, if I understood correctly, the way I would note that is those may be similar in form. In other words, each claims to be universal. But they're very different in content, because a religious term is related to how we live our lives practically. And I'm not sure that the law of gravity will help us understand why we shouldn't lie, right? Or why we shouldn't cheat, or why hate is destructive of human families. So they are similar in form. Each claims to be universal, but they're very different in terms of content. And I think it would help religious people a lot to keep that in mind. There's nothing threatening to belief in God that there happens to be gravity in the universe. We're trying to get at related but different kinds of problems. Right? Is that making sense? Yes. Yes, sir, back here.
I have some difficulty in the link between atheism as a fuel. I have some problems with the difficulty of linking atheism with the fueling of violent religions. Could you explicate that a bit for me, please?
Okay, so if you all have followed, and fabulous questions. Fabulous question. If you followed me, I was trying to argue that, to put this as basic as possible, that the opening to the possibility of violence among non-missionary religions is that one must be in a particular community in some sacred space, and sometimes with respect to a sacred language, okay? Which means that people who are not in that space, that language, that ethnicity, are one's enemy. They are demarcated off. That demarcation can also come within the community, right? So that sets up the possibility of violent expressions, right? Provoked, I'm trying to suggest, by the interaction of practical atheism around the globe. I mean, with the missionary religions, I'm trying to say practical atheism provokes possible violence, because the whole purpose of a missionary religion is to missionize others, right? And how is one going to go about doing that in a way, do you see? So on both sides, I'm suggesting they are placing identity over responsibility. And what I'm trying to get at, and I don't think enough folks, at least in my trade, think about, is how these are how practical atheism, what I'm calling practical atheism, and these violent expressions of religion feed on each other. Right? We were talking before about how dogmatic and rigid the new atheists are. They claim to be scientists, but they don't really want to engage arguments from other disciplines. So there's an odd kind of fundamentalism within that kind of position itself. Yeah? That makes sense. Yes, sir. Or do you want to? I'll point to people. Yes, let's go here, and then we'll go back in the back to one.
Two questions. On the religious side, when you're trying to work toward finding a living future, I think of Paul's statement, the good that I would, I do not do. On the atheist side, once you've controlled enough area to put your beliefs across, what's the meaning of community?
The first one, and then I'll have to ask you to, I'll have to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the second question. The first one is the kind of black hole of ethics, which I'll touch on a little bit this evening. In other words, in fact, one famous Jewish philosopher did a brilliant essay on Paul's discussion, which you're quoting, and he called it the abyss of the will. How is it that we can know, well, let's just do this as a test. Does everyone in this, raise your hand, does everyone in this room do exactly what they know they ought to do in all circumstances? Please raise your hand. This is why we need ethics, you see. This is one of the deepest conundrums of human existence. Now, if you wanted me to go on pontificating about the history of ethics, this is a debate that goes back to the Greek world, and different traditions, different philosophies of the moral life try to address it in different ways. But the fact of moral weakness, which is the term one would use, is a fact of human existence. When I said that part of what it means to be religious is to get access to what empowers one to orient one's life rightly, I'm getting at this problem. I think religions try to not only tell us what's ultimately important and what is ultimately real, but they're trying to get access to a power that will overcome this conundrum, which we've agreed everyone in this room suffers from, right? Except me, of course. So that's why I have that clause in the definition of religion. You won't find that argument in most moral philosophies. Sometimes I put it, I don't know anyone who gave up their lives for Socrates. They did for Jesus, right? Why? Because there's a connection to what empowers a particular kind of life. Okay, now your second question was?
A word on that one. For those in the Christian tradition, sometimes we say the power to move out of ourselves is the Holy Spirit.
Right. That would be, yeah. And then what I would do is try to show what is the ethical relevance of that religious claim, which would have to do with overcoming moral weakness.
The second question is really born out of some experience in terms of working with folks who describe their life more in terms of practical atheism. The difficulty in forming like neighborhood associations and community, because it tends to focus on self, at least in American culture.
Right. We were talking about this at dinner last night, actually. It was just a very good discussion, as you've heard, a delightful time. This is also a two-edged sword. Rousseau begins the social contract with the following line, which I think we should take very seriously. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. In other words, we are social creatures, and that is both good and bad, right? Because it all depends on what community you join. I mean, in this respect, our mothers were all right when they said, be careful who you play with. They were absolutely right. So it may be the case that certain forms of practical atheism can't form communities, but part of the response from the practical atheist might be, that's the point. We can't live a genuinely moral life within communities that distort our perceptions, that put us over and against others, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to be very clear about the ambiguities of even human community. Right? One saw this in World War II with the so-called German Christians. The great majority of Christians in Germany signed up with the fascists. Right? So I think it's very important for those of us who want to think about these matters to address both the fundamental importance and goodness of human community, but also its dangers.
Well, and they conflict.
Right.
I'm American, but I'm a Christian.
Right.
I have a place I hang around with my retired friends, and that's a community, all of which have different opinions.
Right. And that's the problem of how we make choices about our identities. Yeah. I think this lady right here was patiently waiting.
Yeah, I just have a question, and I have not been to a lot of interfaith groups, but we started the session with no prayer, with no community of pooling our spirit, pooling our positive energy, and praying for guidance and so that God would be in our minds and on our lips, and that we could learn. And is that the format of an interfaith group, is to not start with any kind of coming together?
I must admit I can't answer that because I haven't been to these events before here. I don't know, what's the custom? I actually happen to believe that there's something called the piety of thinking. That one of the most important religious acts is to try to think clearly about one's religious life. And that can be a form of devotion itself. So in that sense, I'm trying to engage us in that kind of piety. It's very difficult. That's why I referred to Socrates and to Moses and Jesus at the beginning. It's very difficult, and it can be painful. And there's ways in which I may have said things that provoke people to get angry. I mean, that's why Socrates ends up with a hemlock, right? Everybody knows the story of Socrates being forced. Okay. So I'm trying to practice that kind of piety, if that makes sense. But you're right, there was no prayer.
And I'm very a strong believer in the power of prayer. I don't really care who you pray to or for, but in community spirit, I'm very strong.
Well, that's wonderful. I don't know what's been done in the past, Sylvia. It depends? Okay. I think he was right next, and then we'll come up here.
Thank you. I know you don't want to get into the topic about whether Nazism, communism, secular humanism, economic hedonism are religions or not, but suppose they're just practice lifestyles. Don't they have the same kind of problem? That is to say, there are forms of them which would be life-affirming, But then there are many firms of them that have been life-effacing, and so that if we're going to talk about interreligious dialogue, maybe we need to expand this conversation even further, because the implications of the position you're taking also have a lot to say about the so-called secular alternatives, which do also, in their own way, look at what's most important, most real, and most empowering with respect to what's deficient or impotent in human nature to sustain itself.
Amen. Absolutely right. That's the implication, and this evening I'll be having some other things to say about that. I once had a graduate student who wrote a dissertation entitled "Shopping for Meaning." And he showed through research that the drive of consumerism is not income dependent. In America, there's hard consumerism among the poor as well as among the rich, right? When a certain social form starts adopting those three attributes, and when the people in that social form see the social form as having those three attributes of real, important, and empowering, then yes, I would say there's a functional equivalent to a religion, right? But I don't think what makes the historic religions actual religions is that they intentionally do that. I don't think the market system does not intentionally desire that you see economic wealth as what is ultimately empowered, right? It's open to that, but my own sense is what demarcates a historic religion from other social systems is this business of the intentionality of it. Yes?
But surely Nazism, communism, and other of these social engineering approaches would be intentional.
Well, then they would be forms of religion.
Yeah, they have worship forms and all sorts of...
Right, exactly, exactly. Yes, sorry.
But I just want to follow up on that. Where is the access to the higher power or the reaching beyond yourself? That I'm just curious in those sorts of...
Well, I'll give you an example from the mouth of babes. One time when my son was rather young, we went out to Kmart. I think they still exist, but they went out to Kmart. And it was when Teenage Mutant Turtles just came out, all right? And we were walking through the aisles, and here comes this woman.
And non-missionary religious identity, and that the missionary religion finds its identity in the belief, in sort of the action or the ceremony. And this has a difference when it comes to colonizing people versus colonizing land.
Right.
And I was wondering if this argument only has validity because missionary religions have separated in the modern world the identity from the land. So we define ourselves differently now than perhaps someone might have in the past, saying that I am of this mountain and this river and such.
Yeah, that's why I used the example of baptism in Christianity and said that it's a symbolic death and rebirth. I mean, that's a radical thing to say, that a person's whole previous gendered and ethnic and racial and religious identity is killed. Christianity begins by killing someone, right? And then giving them new life, symbolically, not really. And I think within other missionary religions, there are a similar kind of thing. You must take refuge in the Dharma of the Buddha, right? You become part of the worldwide community of Islam, right? Yeah. And I think that's different than non-missionary religions.
Yeah, I agree with you. What I was confused about is you were pointing to this as a vulnerability within missionary religions. Did you make a claim on how to change that vulnerability then? Are we supposed to focus on...
No, very good. I'm trying to make 2 points. I'm trying to say that all the religions, despite differences, are open to violent expression. I think we have to own that. We have to grasp that that is an ever-present danger within religious traditions. And then I'm asking, how do we escape that problem? And I'm saying the escape comes when we make responsibility the grounds of identity rather than identity the grounds of responsibility. You see, if I'm a Christian and my identity is to missionize the world, and I take that as what is absolutely central, well then it delimits my responsibility for it. Okay?
I agree.
Yeah. Yes, sir, you've been very patient. Am I making sense, folks? Everyone can hear me, and we're getting a good discussion going here. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned that moral philosophy was not maybe in the same arena as the religions. And then Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which my son also found some...
You've been there and done that. I didn't mention my son.
And this may be stepping on tonight, but are there any other places that you can see because where we can have a moral discussion? A Christian layperson, Bernard Brandon Scott, said the reason to save the church, and he was speaking specifically about in-house stuff, not about anybody else, but includes other religions as well as in his spirituality, said that the reason to save the church is because that's probably the only place we can have a moral discussion these days. And what comes to my mind in your conversation, the Ethical Society of St. Louis, which I have been a part of, St. Louis, Missouri, not St. Louis, Michigan. What other places can you see that we can have moral discussions other than world religions?
Very good comment. Couple of points. If it wasn't for Muslims and Christians and Jews, we wouldn't know about Aristotle. We wouldn't know about Plato. We wouldn't know about the Stoics. These great religions are what have been the custodians and also transformers of ancient cultural wisdom. And the same could be done in terms of the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, in terms of indigenous Indian philosophies, right? These have been carriers of those ancient resources. Which means, from my vantage point, religious people shouldn't get freaked out about dealing with moral philosophy. Heck, we're the ones that kept it around, right? We too often negate that to our detriment, right? So on the one hand, what I'm trying to say is, the religions can become a context for moral and political debate because they have helped keep the resources going to carry on those debates, okay? In addition to their own specific heritages and scriptures and so on and so forth. Now, with respect to where is there space in our culture for debate about religious and ethical issues? Well, I can tell you it's not in presidential or congressional elections. I think I can say that with a high degree of confidence, which is really troubling because a democracy doesn't work without debate, without serious engagement about the moral and political issues. What we're seeing is the end of, or the entroublement of democracy itself. And in that context, I think both the religions and groups like this that are sort of civic organizations at a middle level, they are between our daily family lives and local lives and the national and state politics. Right? They're working in a middle zone, as I see it, are extremely important for carrying on these kinds of discussions. And it doesn't surprise me that it's often the religions that make that possible. Can you imagine this kind of diversity in a room that was discussing Democratic politics? Or Republican politics, right? So the religions, what's emerging in the interfaith movement is, I think, a kind of creation of a new form of civil society. That we debate and discuss what does it mean to be civil with each other. Which we desperately need. Okay. Yes, here, and then we'll go over here, and then we'll come here.
Just quick. I'm going back to the universal values that are throughout, I would say, our universe. Kindness, compassion. There may be another one. Is it righteousness? And I think that that would be the foundation of religions. And And I thought about when you were talking about the religions, I'm going back to Karen Armstrong's book on the I think it's the Transformation in Religions. And that was from 1200 BC to 200, and how cultures were changed. And and her worrisome is how are we going to go forward in this? But the cultures were the Greek, the Jewish culture, the Indian culture, and what's the other one? Greek, Jewish, Indian,
Semitic cultures. Semitic cultures.
No, I said Israel. The Hindu, which would be Indian. Okay, that would be the four. But they all had the same philosophy. Do not do unto others what you would want done unto you. And they change cultures. And my thinking is that's what you brought out initially about the Hillel, who he was, what he said, and what Jesus said. So what are the universal values?
Well, two things on that. One, come back this evening because you're anticipating where we're going. But we have to show how they're universal. That's going to be part of the job of the thinker this evening to do. What Armstrong is talking about is very important, and I'll make a radical claim. Scholars denote what they call the Axial Age. Interestingly enough, around the world, in roughly 400 or 500 years, these radical changes came about that gave rise to the classic Indian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, so on and so forth, Christianity. That there seemed to be a kind of seismic shift around the planet among cultures that weren't necessarily connected, that started thinking in more general terms about the conduct of life. Okay? I think we're living through another axial age. And what we're actually trying to deal with is the radical difference among people who are made very close to each other through globalization and worldwide technology and media. This is back to the community thing. I think we also have to be, all of us have to be real honest that human beings don't really like being next to each other too close, right? we really don't. You know, you go into houses and there's 2 bathrooms. That says it all. You know, we are social and non-social animals simultaneously. But what's happening in our time is people are being compressed, right? Proximity is defining the space of human existence. And I think we're trying to think through what that would mean, right? And whether or not it's a kind of new axial age. Someone over here, yes. And then we'll go to...
I've probably naively come to the conclusion that the relationship between religion and violence has been, religion's claim to truth is always certain, the certainty of it. That may be naive, but do you think that plays a role at all in the relationship between religion and violence?
Yeah, a couple of things on that. That's one of the reasons why I want to make responsibility the basis of identity, because responsibility requires the admission of fallibility, the admission of lacking complete knowledge, so that one must seek how to be responsible in a particular situation, which is different than having absolute certainty about one's identity. Now, my own strand of Christianity, Methodism, was founded by John Wesley, has a nice term on this. It's not, I would hope it be agreed by every Christian, but I don't know if it is. He noted in the preface to his 44 sermons that one can die with false opinions, false beliefs. You can die with false beliefs and still go to heaven. But if you die without love, you'll never be in the kingdom of God. That is to say, we ought not to be, if religion is practical, one ought not be so hung up over the rigidity of belief. That's a move I'm making. That's part of the implication of saying religion is practical. Yes, right here. I would actually like to get a debate going between you all, so I'm not up here just fielding questions all the time. Yes.
Well, first of all, great lecture and great discussion, and as you alluded to, I've lived in Washington, D.C. for the last few years, and we don't do nearly enough of this in Washington, D.C. My question, I'm trying to understand exactly what you mean by practical atheism. So I'm wondering, can you be a theoretical atheist but not a practical atheist? And can you be a professing Christian, Jew, Muslim, and yet in some sense a practical atheist?
Absolutely.
Okay. Could you elaborate a bit?
That's in a sense the point. And this was actually an idea, not the term practical atheism, but the problem. Many of the ancient, early Christian thinkers and also Roman Stoics and Platonists argued that the greatest religious failure or affront is not to believe that justice is important. To live one's life as if there are no ultimate values or norms. And they called that practical atheism. People, let's go back to our example of the market system or fascism. Those are systems that people have been swept up in such a way they no longer believe that there are certain moral values that should guide their lives and should criticize their own communities. That's what I'm getting at by the notion of practical atheism. It's sad to say, we had everyone in the room agree. Now I'm going to really be pushing the hemlock problem. We had everyone in the room agree that they fail morally. That's also to say everyone in the room has some tinge of practical atheism. So practical atheism is about the denial of anything sacred, anything divine, anything ultimate moral in the conduct of one's life. Theoretical atheism is simply the denial of the proposition that God exists, or that there's some spiritual realm. So ironically, you can be, whatever we want to say about them, some of the new atheists are actually very moral people who are concerned about justice. That's why what I was trying to get at, the irony that on the one hand, some of them are theoretical atheists, but not practical atheists. Right?
So then as part of our problem, and I think you were getting at this, that we're so focused on belief. I mean, when you said ancient religions tend to be concerned about practice and about practical atheism, but in a lot of our contemporary discussions here in the US, we seem very concerned with belief, what you believe about science, etc. Is that part of our problem?
I'm saying that beliefs should further the responsible life, right? And if they don't, then we have some problems. I want to make one, if I'm understanding you correctly, one note though. When I say practical, I don't mean practices. I mean the conduct of one's whole life. I'm not talking about taking the Eucharist or saying prayers at certain times. That's all very important. But when I say practical, I mean the fact that every one of us in this room got up this morning and had to decide what to do. Do you brush your teeth first or get the coffee? For me, it's always the coffee. Right? We are constantly conducting our lives. You all made a decision to come to this lecture. You may be regretting that now, but you made a decision to come. We are practical beings. That's what I'm trying to get at. Now, we engage in certain practices. That's true. And different religions have different practices, but I'm casting the net actually wider and saying, I want to know, we're talking about the conduct of life. Okay? Very important points. Very important points. Yes, ma'am, there, and then I think the lady in the back also.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this.
So am I. This is great.
I haven't heard the word humanist approached yet, and I like discussion, and I often turn up at the Center for Inquiry, which is a group for people who are spiritual or not religious, or not spiritual at all and not religious at all. And we have a lot of discussion about that, and if you have enough faith to be an atheist, what that means, and if you don't, then you have to be a mushy agnostic or just a humanist, or you gotta put a name on it somehow. But I guess what I need to say is that I don't want to turn this discussion or other discussions into into atheist bashing. I don't really think there are that many atheists out there. Maybe there are. But I think there are many people who can be non-religious and have very high humanist values. And that feels like that's missing in this conversation. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, that's why I just said a moment ago that some of the new atheists, in fact, are profoundly committed to justice. Absolutely. I don't mean to be bashing on missionary and non-missionary religions and practical atheism. These, for me, are just categories. They're concepts to think about human phenomena. And further, in fact, and this may send you all screaming into the night, I understand myself to be a Christian humanist, which has an extremely long tradition. Going back to the early church, one of the early fathers, Irenaeus, said, "The glory of God is man fully alive." I think religious folks have to be, at least in my judgment, have to be committed to some form of humanism. What's interesting about being a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist humanism is you're already... Oh, what's interesting about being a religious humanist is that you're asking how human beings are connected to sacred power as well, which the secular humanist wouldn't do. Yes, so good point. I'm not meaning to bash anybody. You know. Yes, right here and then over here.
Thank you. When we accept the given that with free choice we have responsibility, then that follows that we need to be accountable, and accountable to who? So, what is our motivation to be good? Can we be good for goodness sake, or can we do the Hillel thing or the Buddhist thing? And what I wrestle with is, I accept all that given, but what I wrestle with is where it gets lost, where we hold somebody else responsible for the violence. Like, how could God exist and allow all this bad to happen? Or focus on academically all the commentary or man-made dogma instead of accepting the responsibility and focusing on that.
Absolutely. That's what I'm trying to argue for, that we take responsibility for the way as our traditions are lived.
But with all the intelligence, how is it that we digress or do the bait and switch and spend all this energy and paper and cyberspace on what we should or should not be doing instead of just doing it? That's what I don't understand.
Right. Well, two things on that, if I've understood. This evening I'm going to try to show that certain values inhere at different dimensions of our existence as creatures, and they provide motives for action. Unfortunately, those motives sometimes conflict within our own lives. I mean, I assume everyone in this room has said to themselves, well, I have to go to that damn party, but I'd really rather be, right? We have conflicting motives. So part of the task of ethics is to work that out. We'll be talking a little bit about that this evening.
Well, if you will, so when we exercise our free choice, and with that free choice comes consequences.
Yes.
So you need to live with what you choose, but there's always choices. They may not be the choices that we want, but there are always choices.
Right.
So with the reward of goodness, when judgment comes in the Judaism or the Christian religion, that there will be a reward if you're good, correct?
That is a very interesting It's a very good. My argument is actually, my argument is actually, and this is an argument that is made throughout the Christian tradition and the other biblical religions, Islam, if you are doing what is right only for the sake of what will benefit you, it's not actually a moral action.
I agree.
Right. So then the conundrum becomes, we're back to the point about the weakness of the will. We know what we're supposed to do, we don't do it. That becomes part of the problem. We have to admit that many people are parts of religious communities because they think they're going to benefit from it. The gospel of wealth, for instance. But from an ethical standpoint, that's very problematic. You know, how would you feel? I think sometimes it's best to have an image in your mind when you're thinking about the religious life of your love for someone. You know, would your daughter or son be really happy if you said, you know, I love you because I know you're going to take care of me when I'm old? Right? That destroys the very idea of love, right? And so too with moral motives. Part of what I'll be trying to get at this evening is just how convoluted, complex those motives are, and therefore how tough it is sometimes to live the responsible life. Okay, am I getting to your concern?
I think we're in agreement on what the problem is. I was just wondering how, why it has existed for so long.
Ah, okay. Well, that's what's called an etiological question. It's a question about origins. Where does this all come from? The different religions have different answers to that. Christians look at the problem of the so-called fall, Adam and Eve, sin, and then the rest of humanity is characterized by that.
Well, there again was free choice with accountability.
Yeah, that's right. Some among
But
Judaism...
isn't that, how you call it, allegorical? Aren't we supposed to learn the lesson from that way back when?
Well, okay, now you're asking a different question, which is, and it's back to the weakness of the will problem. Why is it that knowledge is not sufficient to move one to act? Socrates and Plato and the Stoics in the ancient Western world thought that if you knew something was good and didn't act on it, you actually didn't really know it. That knowledge, true knowledge, would always lead to right action. The religions, I think, have a much more complicated picture. A much more complicated picture. And that's different among the various traditions.
So in a Buddha aspect, or walking in the way of Jesus, or I don't know who the person is in the Muslim religion, but is it not a series of learning experiences, like the Native American would say, you don't harbor revenge or anger, you say, thank you for teaching me this lesson, and then move on. Or in Buddhism, I think there's that level of evolution.
Right, that's one of the reasons why it's interesting. Ancient traditions oftentimes speak about themselves. Christianity did this. There's some in Judaism, Islam, as ways of life. And we have to see that it's a lifetime process, folks. You know, it's a lifetime process. So yes, we should see our religious traditions as mechanisms of learning to live in certain ways that have very complex social, ritual, cultic, intellectual ways of helping to form one to live a certain way. That's right. And this is where it becomes difficult, in my judgment, for someone to be spiritual and not religious. Because the spiritual life has to develop. How is it going to develop it if it's just on its own?
And which brings us back to the whole thing about the violence. How do you get, or how do you give yourself a get out of jail free pass and say, well, I can, in the name of God or in the name of my religion, justify going after somebody's food or land or oil or whatever, and justify that in their mind that it's
one can justify
ethically correct.
Yeah, one can justify that. I would merely say as the ethicist, it's not a valid justification. No?
Do you want to have a dialogue
Yes,
across the room?
Excuse me?
Do you want to have a dialogue
Yes,
across
he's
the
got the
room?
mic.
Okay.
I don't know quite what you're asking.
He wants to talk to her. He wants to.
Oh, yes, that'd be great. That'd be great. I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you were getting
I'm
at.
also going to talk to you.
I hope so.
Okay. So I'm largely bored with this discussion. You asked how we felt about it, so I want to be open and honest.
Well, lunch is right next door.
I didn't even get to sign up for lunch. I went online and I was blocked. So I'm going to have to go home and feed my dog and eat lunch there. And depending on how this next 2 minutes goes, I'll decide whether or not to come back.
You have to make a choice, man. I said from the very beginning, doing ethics is risky business because it can offend people's sensibilities.
No, I get it. I get it. No, it's, I mean, this is the dialogue. I was thinking about our rabbi's last sermon, this last Shabbat, and he talked about contradictions and the difficulty and the anxiety involved in embracing contradictions. And this is an anxiety-raising discussion. And so I want to lay out what my contradiction is, and I haven't heard the word revelation mentioned once. God's Torah. I mean, you did quote Hillel, there's also Shammai. I mean, there's also the entire Talmud where no one agrees with each other, and that tension is part of the tradition.
I can't hear you. Hold your mic up.
Sorry, okay, that's better. So part of what's difficult or not comfortable about the discussion for me is that I feel like there's a tacit assumption that we're all in this very universal place, and I'm not there. I mean, I see that piece of it, but it's the tension between what's universal and what's super specific, namely, I'll speak as a Jewish woman, that I'm part of a chosen group, that I have a revelation, or we've received a revelation. I'm not saying I know exactly what it means. I trust my tradition to interpret it, or my traditions, but I think I just want to put that out there. I'm not hearing that as part of the dialogue, and so it ends up feeling like it's just nebulous, lost in space, and doesn't speak to my sense of that we do have, also the word commandment, we do have vehicles and tools that are more practical, if you want to talk about practically dealing with violence. And the other piece is in terms of justification, if we're going to have a discussion about revelation or about prophecy, then it is going to be a more difficult dialogue related to land.